All right, this is my podcast, Teaching Today, Learning to Teach a New Generation with Technology and Identity in Mind. And my name is Allison George. So the first thing is, how do we use technology? And one of the tools that we learned about was spreadsheets. And one of the quotes that I thought was cool from one of our readings was this one here. It says, it's from the reading, but they're quoting somebody else. J.C. Russell in Spreadsheet Activities in Middle School Mathematics observed that a blank spreadsheet can be seen as a student of the student, capable of being taught as directed by the student. The act of teaching the computer to do something specific and meaningful with data helps a student clarify his or her own understanding of the problem. The reason that I picked this one as being really important, when I had first read it, it made me think of how in the classroom, a lot of times, one of the best tools that our students can use in order to learn or to develop their learning is actually to teach a peer. And a lot of times that's why I do collaborative work in the classroom, is so that they have a chance to sit with somebody else and explain a topic, and that then of course helps them better understand the topic when they have to think very carefully about the way that they explain it and the way that they talk to somebody else. They're really developing their own understanding as well. And that's a really cool tool of spreadsheets, is it gives them the opportunity to do that same thing, except for with technology. And one of the benefits of using spreadsheets then versus using collaborative work is it takes away possible times where a student could feel shy or insecure. So collaboration doesn't always work well if the students aren't comfortable with their partner. And so with spreadsheets, there is no insecurities, because you're not talking to somebody who you might feel might judge you based on how you explain it on what you do know or what you don't know. And so I think that's a really cool opportunity that spreadsheets gives to students. It is essentially like teaching it to somebody else, but it is a computer instead of an actual student. And so that comes in when students have to type in the equations that they tell spreadsheet to do, and having to type it in very cautiously to make sure that the spreadsheet does what they're asking it to do. So that's how it enhances their learning and the depth of understanding. And I think too, it gives them an opportunity for exploration and to make sense of the problems and analyze. And one way it does that is that a spreadsheet allows you to calculate a lot of data at once. So you can put in a formula and have it populate to a bunch of different data points much quicker than you could do it personally by hand. And so the accessibility of being able to populate so much at one time makes it a lot easier to then explore the data rather than just have to calculate it. Because, plugging into a formula, it's very dry, like you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, which can be good practice, but I don't want to spend a whole class period plugging in when I want them to get to a place where they get to analyze and look for patterns and create better understanding. And so spreadsheets give them the opportunity to do that as well. The next tool was GeoGebra. And so one of the quotes that I saw from our reading about GeoGebra I thought was neat. It says, the main feature of GeoGebra is a double representation of objects in the form of algebraic and geometric models. And that's apparently where the name comes from, which I didn't know until I read this. Geo from geometry plus gebra from algebra. And being that I personally teach both geometry and algebra right now, it is a pretty useful tool for my classrooms. So some of the benefits, there's really a lot, but I had listed just two on here to get started. With geometry, it has a lot of really good visual representation. So when we get into shapes, when you talk about area, perimeter, transformations, all these different things, geometry allows students to see them and to manipulate them. And that was the other thing is, one of the challenges of spreadsheet is that it can be really challenging for some students who are unsure of how to use it. And I think with GeoGebra, it can be challenging if you give the students a blank slate, but as a teacher, you're able to set up activities and then create it so it's very easy for students to navigate. And I think that's one of the big benefits of using GeoGebra is that if you put in the time, you can create a program that the students can use then that is targeted and very easy for them to manipulate and learn a lot from. Of course, there is some algebra too. I think one of the best things for algebra is the graphs. And so GeoGebra graphs are a big help for students as they try to explore different features of graphs and learn about them. I know I've done some activities where they had to match the graph given using the transformations to an algebraic expression. So like with a quadratic, they would have to use some sliders to try to match the quadratic. Has it been a stretch, a compression, translated, reflected, all those different things. Desmos is another tool that we have talked about. With the use of Desmos in the classroom, I saw this quote and it says, it's a excerpt from a longer piece where they're kind of concluding the whole study. But it talks about their one project they did, and I thought it really relates to any projects you could do with Desmos. Its emphasis on creativity, initiative, inquiry, exploration, and independent work, all features of enriching tasks, can captivate students' interests, and it certainly encourages a deeper understanding of some mathematical concepts, such as functions, domain and range, transformations, etc., that can be rather dry. And so I thought this, even though it was specific to the problem that they were doing in this article, I think this does a really good job of talking about the benefits of using Desmos. And that is, it really does take a concept that could be very mundane, very plain, and it can create a creative side to it because of all the different exploration that you can do in Desmos. For benefits, I left it blank here on my slide because I feel like there's so many different benefits depending on the way that you choose to use Desmos. So one benefit that I have seen this year specifically is that Desmos as a teacher allows you to really see up-to-date feedback automatically as students work through an assignment. And so Desmos has been something that I've used nearly every day as I have students in the classroom and also at home at the same time. I can actively see them participate. I can see them move from slide to slide to slide. As soon as they type something in, I can see what they type in. And whereas before in previous years, I could walk around the classroom and go to somebody's desk and look at their work. Now they can say, hey, Miss George, will you check out my slide 4? And I can find their slide, analyze what they did, and give them some feedback on it. And I think that's a really great tool because it gives them the freedom to move through. It can be really easy for them to ask you to check their work, and it allows you to really see what they're doing. But of course, some other great benefits. Desmos does a lot with graphs. I think it probably started as a graphing thing just based on what I've learned about it so far, that it was a graphing tool to begin with. And it really can graph a lot of different things. Desmos would even graph a whole box plot for you if you use the correct function. And so the graphing tools similar to GeoGebra, except I think that it is even easier to use Desmos for students than it is GeoGebra because the Desmos calculator uses a lot of functions that are pretty easy. You just type them in, and if you don't know what to type in, you can find it in their library of functions to use. You can type it in, you can play around with it, zoom in, zoom out. and things like that. And what's really cool is then when you're creating lessons and slides for students to move back and forth through, you can add and incorporate those graphs in there so that they can use the graph during the lesson as well. And so that's been a really cool benefit of Desmos too. So moving on to teaching the CHRL, culturally, historically responsive lessons framework. And there's a few different things to keep in mind, just that what I have collected from our reading. The first one being pursuit of identity. And personally, being in the high school classroom, I know high school can be a really challenging time for some students. And they are struggling to find themselves, to figure out where they fit, especially in today's day and age where social media has become such a big thing. I feel like students are so influenced by social media and what they see on TV. And they're really trying to develop their own sense of self. And they do so based a lot on what they are seeing. And as a lot of us know, social media is not always a great representation for what people are really like. A lot of people present their best self on social media. And so I think it creates really high standards, and it can be really hard to find where you fit in. And so creating opportunities for students to have a pursuit of identity in the classroom, I think is really important, because we as teachers, and just being older and out of the high school mindset, we understand a little bit more of what it means to really find yourself and to have that opportunity to create your own personality and your own brand and being who you want to be and finding things that are important to you. And so we have an opportunity to work that into our lessons and get to help students find that. Some of them might like to find their identity in social media, and then some of them might be feeling really lost. And so in our lessons, we can give those that are feeling lost those opportunities that they haven't had so far. With criticality, and really kind of goes into historically responsive lessons a little bit too. But with criticality, obviously right now we've got a lot of social issues going on in our world, and being able to bring those into the classroom is important. I think there's a lot of history that has not been talked about in the classroom. And whether that is because people didn't want to talk about it or they were shying away from it because it can be uncomfortable to talk about certain things, it's important that we don't do that and that we really take the time to have those conversations. And it can be tricky as teachers, because while you might personally fall on one side or the other, it's up to us to present an almost neutral stance so that we are not putting our own bias onto our students, but that we are just giving them a space to feel comfortable, to talk, to learn, to hear from their peers, and just to start to become comfortable with having those conversations in constructive ways. I think right now, a lot of times I see that adults, some of them are good at it, but some adults really have a hard time having constructive conversations with each other about challenging topics. And I think that's one thing that we could have the opportunity to influence in the future generations, is that they would, from a young age, learn how to talk about social issues, how to get engaged and involved in social issues, and how to do it in a way where they can constructively talk to people who are on different sides of social issues of them, and also just ways to support those issues. Even though they're young, they still have an opportunity to be involved and to fight for what they believe in. And then something I thought was important, the history of math. And this is, specifically for mathematics, math can seem so unrelated to students. It's just out there. It's this weird thing with numbers and letters, and I don't know when I'm going to use this. And I think the history of math is something that is never really taught to students, and it could be taught a lot more. It's really interesting where math comes from and why it was created and how it was found. For some of our students, they probably won't use some of the things that we teach them ever again. But what they might find interesting is just learning where it came from. So, that kind of goes back into a discussion that we had earlier on in the semester is what would be your demands for education? And this isn't a demand by any means, but just an interesting thought would be, what if we changed curriculum to involve the history of math? And we taught less content, but went deeper into the content, learned about its history and stuff. And I think that would be a really interesting idea to look into more, just to see how that could benefit students. I just think it would open a lot of doors to some kids who don't love math, but maybe are more history driven. And it'll help them then see themselves a little bit more in the lessons because it's something they're interested in. They want to learn about history. And so now that they can relate history to the subject that they didn't necessarily like before, that might be a great way to get them engaged as well. Historically responsive lessons is a big one. Really kind of hits, it's like the last two together, right? Criticality and the history of math. Well, with the history of math, you could also talk about how history was influenced by math. So not just the history of how math came about, but how math could have influenced history as well. And so I think that's a really interesting one. I think it can be really difficult. It's not always easy to relate math topics to history because even if there is math in some of the history, it's not always obvious. I know one of my lessons that I created was about transformations, and the question that I posed to students is, where might transformations have shown up in history? And I really have a hard time answering that myself because I'm not really sure. There's definitely things that you could say, this is where it might have shown up. They might have used transformations in this sense or this sense, but I don't know for sure. There isn't a book that says transformations led to this. And so while that can be difficult, it also can be an interesting conversation that lets students be creative. If there are no examples of transformations being used in history, could you create one? Could you think, well, maybe the soldiers who were fighting in the Civil War created their maps, their game plans for the war, and they used transformations to move their troops around on the map. Probably didn't actually happen, but it kind of lets students relate what we're learning to an idea creatively that even though it didn't actually happen that way, you could make those connections and you are accurately connecting the concepts we learn to an area where even if it wasn't used, sure, I could see how you could apply it there. Next thing is learning in other cultures. And we talked about this a little bit with, I believe it was the African-centric learning and Eurocentric, if I'm remembering correctly. And those two types of learning talked about individualism versus collectivism. And just those different types of learning styles and ways that you can promote community throughout the school, right? We talk about community that is individualistic, thinks I want to fight my way to the top, versus when it is collective, you are working with your peers. You want everybody to succeed and you're working together to get there. And I think that that was a really great example to start thinking about other cultures and the way that they teach and learn. But that's not the only one. I think there's a lot of other things that we can learn from the way that other cultures approach education. And that's something that through this class I've learned I would like to research more and look more into. And then the last one, and this one I think is so important, is just teaching with love. And this, I think, was one of the last weeks in our reading. We read about one chapter. It was really all about just teaching with love and how you can show love to your students and accept them for who they are, and how really using the CHRL framework shows that love. And that's a great way to tell them, hey, I love you, like I see you, I want to know more about you, and I love every part of you. And that's so important, and just to create a positive atmosphere in the classroom as well. So then creating our structured tasks, mine specifically, so for spreadsheets, my task was about comparing compound interest, a lesson where we look at various compound interest intervals. And with that lesson, I used the spreadsheet to allow students to calculate the amount, the final amount in a bank account after X amount of years. And we got to do that for 3 separate bank accounts who were all compounded different number of times per year. So annually, quarterly, monthly. And in this is an example where, because Excel was able to quickly calculate 10, 20, 30 years for all 3 banks, you could really gather a lot of data and compare and contrast which one would be the best. One of the other things that was really cool about this activity was then after the spreadsheet calculated everything, it was really easy to go back into, I guess we could call it our key. We created a key with, here's my initial amount, here's the rate, here's the interval number, and then go back in and update those numbers. And once you update it, automatically all of the data would update as well. And that was really cool that students, once they put in the work to create the spreadsheet, could easily start to manipulate pieces and analyze how what they changed affect the problem as a whole. And then connecting that to the CHRL framework, we had discussions about how investing your money is so important, and just teaching students about investment opportunities, how to invest their money to make more money, and also how to be aware of what's going on. I think that's something that's important, and students understand, even if the bank is just going to calculate my interest for me, I still want to know what to expect. That you don't want to be gypped out of money. You don't want to be taken advantage of. And so just teaching them ways that they can become self-sufficient gives them more responsibility and the ability to fend for themselves. And so that was kind of what we talked about with the spreadsheet activity. With the GeoGebra activity, this was a really fun activity that I've actually used a lot of times in the classroom. I created it a few years ago and then spent the time this semester really focusing on the CHRL framework part of the lesson itself. But in this activity, I created a cartoon with scenes that the students had to use transformations to match with the characters. And it's a pretty cool activity because they have a lot of fun moving things around, taking the pictures. Usually we do it as a collaborative team. But it is cool because you can connect it to cartoons. And that's something that a lot of kids either currently watch or have watched in the past. And so we open up with a video from Pixar animators just talking about how much math is in animation to get them thinking about different jobs that they might not have realized math is in. Often I tell students, you might not think that you want to do a job that includes math, but I want you to not start closing doors for yourself right now. Don't ever decide, oh, I'm over this, I don't want to learn it, because you never know what you might want to do in the future. And right now, you don't want to make a decision that's going to hinder you later on. And I think showing them examples where math shows up in various professions is a great way to help them understand that, wow, math is really universal. It could show up in a lot of different occupations. And so I really need to pay attention and try to learn something from it. With this too, we can talk, I talked before about connecting it to history, and how do we talk about something that is kind of a stretch to see transformations in history, but getting to actually connect and relate it back to history is pretty cool. And, students they have to be creative to do that, because it's not something that's obvious. But it really creates cool discussions with them. And once one student takes a leap to say, oh, I think it could be used this way, it starts to get the wheels turning for other students and creates a discussion about it. The last one for Desmos, I created a lesson about maximizing profit, which really used linear programming to look at how you can maximize an objective function, how you can use constraints and inequalities to maximize your business plan, and things like that. So really connecting it to the business world. And what had inspired me in this lesson is I have 2 students right now, they're sisters, and during the pandemic, they actually created a business. And so all throughout the pandemic, they were making things and selling them, and they made like a whole bunch of money in the like $10,000, $50,000, somewhere in that range, which is pretty good for 2 high school students for just a few months, under a year. They really did a great job with that. And it was really neat to see how hard they worked and what a great job they did. And since they were in the class this year, it was really easy to talk to them and get them to share their story with the students and show the students, hey, like, you have the ability to do this. We talk a lot about things that could be helpful for you years down the line. And they don't realize that if they really put in the work, they could do some of these things right now. And I thought that was a really cool lesson that we got to connect it to those students and then have the discussion, well, what would your business plan be? Where would you want to, how could you open up your own business? What would you be interested in selling? And of course, this is one that's kind of easy to relate to history, because probably every business ever has used these ideas. So that's a good one, but it also does relate to other things as well. Linear programming goes beyond just businesses. And so that's kind of a challenge that I said to my students in the discussion was, okay, we've related this to business and that's cool, but where else in history besides businesses could you see a model like this happening? And so one example would be in, again, wars, because you have constraints on how much resources you have, on how many hours you might have, how many people you might have. And so having to maximize, I guess, to strategize your best game plan. This could be an example where that was used. You could talk about social movements and how even those things, they could be under a time crunch. They might not have a lot of funds that have been raised. They might be looking at numbers of people. How can we make the biggest influence just based on what we have? And so showing them how this could apply to a social movement is a really cool connection, because it's something that they could do, considering that, they have limited resources. And if they want to maximize their resources to make the biggest impact, they could use linear programming. But getting to use Desmos for this was pretty cool too, because Desmos does a really great job of graphing and shading regions and restricting kids to looking at exactly what I as the teacher want them to look at, while still having creative freedom. There was an article that I had read in another class, I believe, not this class, but it talked about how sometimes we give students too much freedom, especially when we want them to discover things. Because if we give them too much freedom in discovery, sometimes they can discover the wrong thing. And discovery learning is so impactful that they're more likely to now remember the wrong thing since they discovered it themselves. And so one cool tool about using Desmos, especially in this lesson, was that they could have the freedom, but have enough restriction where they're not going to go and possibly teach themselves something that is totally wrong. Of course, there's little misconceptions, but they're not going to do that as much. So this whole semester, I think I've really learned a lot. Just talking about the structured tasks from before, we've made, personally, I have made a lot of lesson plans in the past, going through college myself. And when you get into education as an actual teacher, you don't tend to make lesson plans as much that are so in-depth. So it had been a while since I had written one so in-depth. But I think getting the opportunity to do it, it does remind you about how many little things you do need to prepare for when creating a lesson. And it helped me to understand how to now incorporate the CHRL framework into such lessons. That structured task really helped break down, okay, remember, think about identity, think about how you're going to relate it to self, how are you going to teach them skills for the real world. And taking the time to reflect on those things and create those questions, I think was really helpful. You know, the reason why as a teacher now I cannot make those crazy lesson plans that we did in undergrad is because I did so many that it becomes much more natural to include those things. And so just getting to write just 3 structured tasks and hopefully do more later, it just makes creating those opportunities for the framework to be incorporated just more natural, and that I could start to do it more often and frequently in the classroom. So that was a really good experience for me personally. You know, I teach at a school that is pretty diverse. I've got a lot of diversity in my classroom. And the school itself does a really great job of celebrating that. We have a diversity day where we celebrate a lot of the different cultures of students who go to our school. And even though the school does a great job of it, I would love to do a better job of it in my own class. I want students to know that while I love them, I also see them, and I can acknowledge who they are, the culture that they come from, and not just acknowledge it, but appreciate it and want to draw attention to it, learn about it, teach about it, and just for us all to grow more aware and appreciative of those around us in our community. You know, and just learning about the framework in general, it's something that is talked about a lot, that we want to create lessons that relate to students. But getting to actually hear about this framework really helped to break it down and talk about different ways that we can do that. Like I've said a few times, it can be really hard to incorporate it into some lessons that don't seem like they really relate to anything. Transformations is one that I would have related to cartoons, but I would have never related to history because I just wouldn't see the connection. But this semester, I've learned more about how to make those connections and to have those discussions during more lessons than just the ones that are very obvious. One thing that I've really enjoyed is getting to learn from all of you, all of my peers in this class. It is really awesome when you get to collaborate with other teachers, and I'm very fortunate to work at a school where I get to collaborate with my peers often, but we all share very similar experiences being at the same school. So while we get to collaborate with our ideas, we don't know much outside of our own culture at our school. So getting to read your posts and just see what's going on at other schools has been a very, very interesting, very helpful to me to hear that and to get ideas from you guys and learn from you. I think it's been a really cool experience to do that. And yeah, I think that covers my experiences. Here are my references. Thank you for listening to my podcast. Talk to you later.